Welcome to Godless and Grounded. The Bible is often presented as a book filled with divine wisdom, timeless truths, and predictions about the future that supposedly prove the existence of God. Believers point to prophecies as evidence that the Bible is not an ordinary book written by humans, but something inspired by a higher power. They argue that fulfilled prophecies set the Bible apart from every other religious text. But when we actually look at these so-called prophecies, the picture that emerges is very different. Many are vague, absurd, impossible, or outright failures. Some sound like random guesses while others look like predictions written long after the events already happened. Far from being evidence of divine knowledge, biblical prophecies often expose the limitations of ancient human imagination. Let us start with a very simple observation. A prophecy should be clear, specific, and testable. If someone says a great kingdom will rise and fall, that is not a prophecy. That is a statement of the obvious. Every kingdom in history has risen and fallen. If someone says there will be wars, famines, and earthquakes, that is also not a prophecy. Those are things that always happen in different parts of the world. Yet the Bible is filled with these kinds of predictions. Jesus himself in the New Testament says there will be wars and rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, and earthquakes in diverse places. That sounds impressive only until you realize that in every century of recorded human history, there have been wars and earthquakes. It would be like predicting that tomorrow the sun will rise. It does not take divine knowledge to state the obvious. One of the most absurd so-called prophecies in the Bible is the prediction about Tyre, found in the book of Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel claimed that the mighty city of Tyre would be destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. He went into detail, saying the walls would be broken down, the city would be made like a bare rock, and fishermen would spread their nets over the ruins. The problem is that Nebuchadnezzar never destroyed the city of Tyre. He besieged it for years but failed to conquer it completely. The city continued to thrive for centuries afterward. Later writers sometimes claim Alexander the Great fulfilled the prophecy when he attacked Tyre. But even that does not fit Ezekiel's words. The city was never permanently destroyed in the way Ezekiel described. People still live in Tyre today. If a prophet says a city will be destroyed and never rebuilt, but the city still exists, that prophecy has failed. Believers may twist themselves into knots trying to reinterpret the words, but the plain fact remains. Ezekiel's prophecy about Tyre was wrong. That alone should be enough to raise questions about the reliability of biblical prophecy. Another classic failed prophecy is found in Ezekiel. Again, this time about Egypt. He claimed that Egypt would be desolate and uninhabited for 40 years. According to him, no foot of man or beast would pass through it, and afterward, the Egyptians would return as a weak and lowly kingdom, never rising again to greatness. History completely contradicts this. Egypt was never left empty for 40 years. People lived there continuously. It remained a significant power for centuries, and even today, Egypt is one of the largest nations in the Middle East. Ezekiel's words about Egypt being permanently weak are absurd when we see the reality of Egyptian influence in history and politics. If this prophecy were truly from God, we would expect accuracy. Instead, we find blatant failure. Moving to the New Testament, one of the strangest and most problematic prophecies comes from Jesus himself. He repeatedly told his disciples that the end of the world was near, within their own lifetimes. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." He was talking about cosmic signs, the coming of the Son of Man, and the final judgment. The plain reading is that he believed the end of the world would happen within a generation, about 40 years. But here we are, nearly 2,000 years later, and the world has not ended. Christians often reinterpret this, saying generation means something symbolic, or that Jesus was speaking about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, which did happen in 70 CE. But the language is much broader than that. He spoke of stars falling from heaven, angels gathering the elect, and all tribes of the earth mourning. That is not simply about the temple. It is about the apocalypse. If Jesus truly made that claim, and it did not happen, then we are left with one of the biggest failed prophecies in the entire Bible. This is not a minor issue either, because Christianity rests heavily on the authority of Jesus' words. The book of Revelation is another goldmine of absurd and failed prophecies. Written around the late 1st century, it predicts that Jesus will return soon, that great cosmic battles will unfold, and that the end of history is just around the corner. But every generation of Christians since then has been waiting for these events, and none have come true. Believers keep reinterpreting the text to fit whatever historical events are happening in their own time. When the Roman Empire was collapsing, they thought Revelation was about Rome. When Europe faced the Black Death, some thought it was the end. In the 20th century, people thought World War II was described in Revelation. Today, some interpret it to be about nuclear war or modern Israel. The fact that it can be endlessly reinterpreted is actually a sign of how vague and absurd it is. A real prophecy should not need constant redefinition. If the same prediction can be applied to hundreds of different events across thousands of years, it is not prophecy at all. It is simply poetic guesswork. One of the most peculiar biblical prophecies is the idea that the Messiah would be born of a virgin. This comes from the book of Isaiah, which mentions a young woman, or maiden, giving birth. The original Hebrew word does not even mean virgin. It simply refers to a young woman of marriageable age. But when the text was translated into Greek, the translators used a word that implied virginity, and later Christians took it literally. They retroactively turned it into a prophecy about Jesus being born of a virgin. But in the context of Isaiah, it was about a sign for King Ahaz concerning events of his own time, not something that would happen hundreds of years later. The so-called prophecy is based on a mistranslation and misinterpretation. If the foundation of a prophecy is a language error, how can it be taken seriously? The Bible also includes strange symbolic prophecies that are almost laughable when examined. For instance, Daniel interprets a dream of King Nebuchadnezzar about a giant statue made of different metals. The statue supposedly represents successive empires that will rise and fall. But historians can see that this so-called prophecy was written after many of those events had already happened. It is like writing in the year 2025 that there would one day be a great nation called the United States, then predicting that it will decline. Writing history in the form of prophecy is not divine foresight. It is simply retroactive storytelling. Scholars widely believe that much of Daniel was written long after the Babylonian and Persian empires had already fallen, which makes the prophecy meaningless. What makes these failed and absurd prophecies even more revealing is how people continue to believe in them despite overwhelming evidence against them. For example, consider the prophecy in the Gospel of Matthew that the Messiah would be called a Nazarene. The problem is that nowhere in the Old Testament does such a prophecy exist. Matthew seems to have invented it or confused it with another term. Scholars have pointed out that he may have mistaken the Hebrew word netzer, meaning branch, for Nazarene. Yet Christians often point to this as evidence of prophecy fulfilled in Jesus. In reality, it looks more like a mistake or even a fabrication. We can also talk about the prophecy that Damascus, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, would be destroyed and never rebuilt. The prophet Isaiah said Damascus would cease to be a city and become a heap of ruins. Yet, Damascus has been continuously inhabited for thousands of years. It remains a major city today. The fact that the Bible predicted its permanent destruction and yet the city thrives shows just how absurd the claim was. Believers sometimes argue that maybe it will happen in the future, but if a prophecy can remain unfulfilled for thousands of years, then it has no real meaning. Anyone could predict that someday a city will be destroyed. Given enough time, it might happen. That does not make it divine knowledge. If we think carefully, many of these prophecies reflect nothing more than the political concerns of their time. Ancient prophets often predicted doom for neighboring nations or triumph for their own people. It is easy to see why. They were writing to inspire or scare their audience, not to provide accurate predictions of the future. If Israel was threatened by Babylon, the prophets would predict Babylon's destruction. If Israel was oppressed by Egypt, they would predict Egypt's downfall. This was more about politics and morale than divine foresight. The fact that so many of these predictions turned out false or only partially true confirms that we are dealing with human imagination, not supernatural knowledge. We also see absurdity in the prophecy that the earth is fixed and cannot be moved. In Psalms and Chronicles, the Bible declares that God established the earth so firmly that it will never move. At the time, this reflected the ancient belief that the earth was flat and stationary, but modern science has proven that the earth does move. It spins on its axis and orbits the sun. Not only does it move, it hurtles through space at incredible speeds. The biblical claim is scientifically false, yet some believers still try to defend it. They say it is symbolic or poetic. But if we accept that excuse, then what is the point of prophecy at all? If everything can be dismissed as metaphor, we can never know what is literal and what is not. There are also prophecies about the Messiah that turned out to be absurd when applied to Jesus. For example, one prophecy claimed the Messiah would be called out of Egypt. The Gospel of Matthew tries to make this fit by inventing a story of Jesus' family fleeing to Egypt and then returning. But if we look at the original Old Testament text, it was not even a prophecy. It was a historical reference to Israel being brought out of Egypt during the Exodus. Matthew simply took a past event and twisted it into a prophecy. This kind of retrofitting is common in the Bible. Writers would comb through old texts and force them to apply to new situations. That is not prophecy. That is rewriting history. Another problem is that many prophecies are so conditional that they lose all meaning. Jonah, for instance, warned the city of Nineveh that it would be destroyed in 40 days. But when the people repented, God changed his mind and spared the city. Believers call this mercy, but skeptics see the problem clearly. If a prophecy can simply be canceled, then it is not really a prophecy. Imagine if a weather forecaster said a hurricane will strike tomorrow, but then when it does not, they claim it was because people prayed hard enough. That is not prediction, that is excuse-making. A failed prophecy covered by a loophole is still a failed prophecy. We also find in the Bible prophecies about the supposed end of suffering, peace on earth, and universal worship of God. Isaiah speaks of wolves lying with lambs, swords being turned into plowshares, and nations learning war no more. These are beautiful images, but they are also absurd when taken as predictions. Thousands of years have passed since they were written, and the world is still full of violence, war, and injustice. If these words were truly from an all-knowing being, why would they remain unfulfilled for so long? Believers often push them into the future, saying they will come true in the end times. But this raises a question. What good is a prophecy if it is always postponed? A prediction that never comes true is no different from one that never existed. Some prophecies are absurd not only because they failed, but also because they contradict each other. For example, the Old Testament says the Messiah will be a mighty king who rules forever on David's throne, but the New Testament portrays Jesus as a suffering servant who was executed. To reconcile this, Christians created the idea of a second coming. But this is just moving the goalposts. If the original prophecy had been accurate, Jesus would have fulfilled it the first time. Inventing a second chance does not fix the failure. It only shows how people bend the meaning of prophecy to keep their faith alive. Consider also the prophecy that the righteous will never be forsaken, or that their children will not beg for bread. This is found in Psalms and Proverbs. Yet history shows countless righteous and devout people have suffered poverty, hunger, and persecution. If you walk through any war-torn region or famine-stricken area, you will find people who are deeply religious and yet suffer terribly. The idea that faith protects from hunger is contradicted by reality. If anything, many of the world's most devout regions are also among the poorest. This makes such promises not only absurd but cruel, because they raise false hopes that faith will bring material blessings. Another prophecy often pointed out by Christians is the prediction of the Messiah riding into Jerusalem on a donkey. This comes from the book of Zechariah. But even here, it looks less like a prediction and more like a story deliberately written to make it appear fulfilled. The Gospel writers may have shaped the story of Jesus to match the prophecy. In fact, the Gospel of Matthew awkwardly describes Jesus riding on both a donkey and a colt at the same time, because he misunderstood the poetic parallelism in Zechariah. That is not divine prophecy being fulfilled, that is human error in interpretation. Let us not forget the bizarre apocalyptic prophecies that involve stars falling to earth, the moon turning to blood, and the sky being rolled up like a scroll. These are images repeated in Revelation and the Gospels. But anyone with basic knowledge of astronomy can see the absurdity. Stars are massive suns, many times larger than Earth. If even one star literally fell onto the Earth, the planet would be vaporized instantly. The idea that stars can fall to the ground reflects an ancient worldview where stars were thought to be small lights hanging in the sky. In other words, the prophecy is based on ignorance of the natural world. The same goes for the sky being rolled up like a scroll. The sky is not a curtain that can be folded away. These are poetic images mistaken for predictions. They reveal the limited scientific understanding of the writers, not the voice of an all-knowing God. Another example of absurd prophecy is the claim that the world would end soon after the resurrection of Jesus. In the letters of Paul, especially in Thessalonians, Paul speaks as if he expects to be alive when Jesus returns. He says, "We who are alive and remain until the coming of the Lord will be caught up together with him." He truly believed the end was imminent. 2,000 years later, we can see clearly that he was wrong. His sense of urgency shaped early Christianity, making them believe the world was about to end. This may explain why they gave up possessions, expected no long-term future, and lived with such intensity. But as the years passed and the end did not come, Christians had to adjust their theology. What started as a failed prophecy was gradually reinterpreted as a distant future hope. What is striking when we examine all these prophecies is how human they are. They reflect the fears, hopes, and limited knowledge of ancient people. They wanted enemies to fall, their nation to rise, and the world to change dramatically in their favor. But none of this requires divine inspiration. Anyone living in times of war and uncertainty could make the same predictions. The fact that the Bible is filled with failed, vague, and absurd prophecies shows that it is a human book, not a supernatural one. If we take away the authority of prophecy, one of the main pillars of faith collapses. And when it collapses, what remains is simply a collection of ancient writings, interesting from a historical perspective, but not from a divine one. Even today, religious leaders still use biblical prophecies to control and scare people. They claim current events are fulfilling Scripture. Wars in the Middle East, natural disasters, pandemics, political turmoil, everything is said to be predicted in the Bible. But notice how the details always change depending on what is happening in the world. In the Cold War, the prophecies were said to point to Russia. After 9/11, they pointed to terrorism and Islam. Now, some claim they point to climate change or artificial intelligence. This moving target proves that biblical prophecy is not real prediction, but a flexible tool used by believers to fit their own time. The most absurd thing about biblical prophecies is not just their failure, but the way people cling to them despite the evidence. A prophecy that fails should be abandoned. Yet instead, believers reinterpret it, twist it, or push it into the future. They say it is symbolic, or that it refers to something invisible, or that it will happen later. This endless reinterpretation turns prophecy into an unfalsifiable idea. But if a claim cannot be proven false, it is worthless as evidence. Real knowledge requires clear predictions that can be tested. Prophecy fails that test over and over again. When we step back and look at the big picture, the Bible's so-called prophecies reveal more about human psychology than divine truth. People want certainty. They want to believe that the chaos of history is under control. They want to think their suffering has meaning and that justice will eventually prevail. Prophecy provides that comfort. But comfort is not the same as truth. The absurdity of biblical prophecies lies not only in their failures and contradictions, but in the way they expose our deep human need for reassurance, even when it is based on false promises.